Imagine walking through this pristine, perfectly manicured botanical garden.
Okay, yeah.
You know, you can smell the trimmed boxwoods. Every tree is carefully labeled with a little brass plaque.
Right.
The paths are paved in neat brick. The hedges are sculpted into these flawless geometric shapes, and everything just feels orderly.
Very designed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Destined to be exactly where it is. And that is very often how we are taught to view history, and specifically, I mean, the history of religion.
Oh, absolutely.
We tend to see it as this straight, clean, inevitable line leading directly from a definitive origin point straight to our modern doorstep. Like, we look at the dominant institutions of our time, and we just naturally assume they were always destined to be the grand, towering oaks of that botanical garden.
It is, it's an incredibly comforting view of the past.
Mm-hmm.
You know, human beings are pattern-seeking creatures.
Right.
We crave narrative arcs that make sense of our current reality. So we retroactively impose order on history. We smooth out all the rough edges and just sort of ignore the chaotic variables that actually shape the world.
But the moment you step off that paved path, you realize the illusion.
Yeah.
You push past those manicured hedges, you stumble down a steep embankment, and suddenly you aren't in a garden at all. You are standing in the middle of a dense, overgrown, chaotic jungle.
And you need a machete just to see 2 feet in front of you.
Exactly. When you look closely at the early centuries of Christianity, that meticulously pruned tree of history just completely disappears. Instead, you find a theological Wild West.
A total landscape of chaos.
I mean, it's teeming with fire-breathing Virgin Marys, Jesus wielding a magic wand, and absolutely brutal, bloody political battles over who gets to hold the pointing shears.
The historical waters are incredibly muddy, and frankly, that makes them infinitely more fascinating than the sanitized garden tour.
Oh, for sure.
The reality of how modern belief systems were forged, it involves contingency, political maneuvering, and just a staggering amount of sheer, unpredictable human weirdness.
Well, welcome to the Deep Dive. We are thrilled you are joining us today because our mission is a massive one.
It really is.
We are going to cut through millennia of dogma, centuries of history, and some very heavy historical revisionism to explore the true, unvarnished origins of early Christianity.
Right, and we're going to uncover the sheer mind-boggling diversity of early Christian beliefs.
And chart the invention of a very specific world-altering concept, you know, the concept of heresy.
So to map out this jungle for you, we have assembled a phenomenal stack of sources. At the center is Catherine Nixie's provocative, extensively researched book, Heresy, Jesus Christ, and the Other Sons of God.
A great read.
Yeah, and we are pairing her work with multiple academic reviews and analyses from The Guardian, The New Humanist, and really robust critical counter-perspective from the Church Times.
We are also pulling from deep academic wellsprings, including Robert M. Royalty Jr.'s meticulous study, The Origin of Heresy. And to make sure we have the absolute widest lens possible, we're drawing on comprehensive historical encyclopedia entries covering the evolution of the concept of heresy itself and the fascinating, surprisingly ubiquitous history of the title Son of God across various ancient cultures.
But before we jump in, we need to set the stage for you, the listener. It is absolutely crucial to understand that our goal today is not to validate or invalidate any specific faith, doctrine, or modern religious practice.
Right. We're not taking sides here.
Exactly. We are approaching this as historians, sociologists, and curious observers. This is an impartial, rigorous exploration of how a brilliantly pluralistic, chaotic movement was, over centuries, forcefully pruned into a single orthodoxy.
And perhaps most importantly, we're looking at how the winners of that struggle secured the exclusive right to write the history books.
Yeah. That's the key.
So if we really want to understand how a single specific version of Jesus of Nazareth became the dominant, world-shaping figure of Western history, we actually cannot start with him.
No, we really can't.
We have to rewind the tape and look at the political and spiritual mechanics of the world he was born into. Because the Roman Mediterranean of the first century wasn't a world sitting around patiently waiting for the Son of God to arrive.
It was a world completely crowded with them.
Yes.
The title Son of God, or its localized variations like Son of Heaven, was a highly effective, well-worn political tool long before the first century.
I mean, it was the ultimate mechanism for legitimizing absolute authority.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Let's look east first. We find the ancient Chinese concept of Tianzi, which translates to Son of Heaven. This originated way back in the Western Zhou dynasty, around 1000 BCE.
So a full millennium before the events of the New Testament.
Right, and the mechanism there wasn't necessarily about a literal biological descent from a deity sitting on a cloud, right?
It was more about a cosmic contract.
Precisely. In the Chinese context, the emperor was the son of heaven, reflecting the mandate of heaven. This was a brilliant functional political philosophy.
How so?
Well, it meant the emperor was the earthly delegate responsible for the well-being of the world. He had divine sanction to rule, but that sanction was conditional.
So there was a catch.
A huge catch. If the emperor was cruel, or if there was a massive famine or a catastrophic flood, the philosophical framework allowed the people to argue that heaven had withdrawn its mandate.
Like the son had failed the father.
Exactly. Which completely justified rebellion and the installation of a new dynasty.
That is fascinating. But crossing the globe to Egypt, the concept of divine sonship shifts from a cosmic contract to literal physical embodiment.
Yeah, a completely different flavor.
The pharaohs weren't just delegates hoping to keep the mandate. They were considered actual breathing gods on earth.
Egypt maintained a long-lasting tradition where pharaohs were referred to as the son of a particular deity, often Amun or Ra, and the mythologies sometimes described their divine begetting in sexually explicit physical detail.
Just to remove any doubt about their pedigree, I assume.
Exactly. But the most fascinating pivot point in this history and a chilling preview of what would happen centuries later in Rome was Amenhotep IV, better known as Akhenaten.
The heretic pharaoh.
The very one. He radically redefined the mechanics of the pharaoh's godship. In the 14th century BCE, Akhenaten essentially declared that there was only one god in Aten, represented by the sun disk.
Okay.
And crucially, he declared that he, Akhenaten, was the sole cleric and the only son to this single father god.
I want to pause on the why of that move. Because he wasn't just having a spiritual awakening, right?
Oh, not at all.
The traditional Egyptian pantheon was massive, and every major god had a massive temple complex run by incredibly wealthy, powerful priests.
Right. The priests of Amun in Thebes practically rivaled the pharaoh in wealth and political influence.
That is the exact mechanism at play. By declaring there is only one god and that he alone is the son of that god, Akhenaten wasn't just changing theology.
He was executing a massive transfer of wealth and power.
Exactly. He effectively stripped the other priesthoods of their authority, closed their temples, and centralized all religious, political, and economic power entirely into his own filial relationship with the divine.
He even built a brand new capital city, Amarna, to physically separate his new monotheistic administration from the old power structures.
So the blueprint of using a single god and his single earthly son to obliterate political rivals was already ancient history by the time Rome rolled around.
It really was.
And the Romans took this concept, stripped it of its ancient mysticism, and turned it into a hyper-efficient, legalistic art form.
The Roman application begins during the chaotic transition from the Republic to the Empire. After Julius Caesar was assassinated in 42 BCE, he was formally deified by the Roman state.
Right.
A comet appeared in the sky during his funerary games, and the political machine immediately spun this as proof that Caesar had ascended to the heavens. He became Divus Iulius, the divine Julius.
Now, his adopted son, Octavian, who would later become Augustus, the first Roman emperor, sees this comment and realizes he's just been handed the ultimate political trump card.
Yep.
If your adopted dad is suddenly a recognized god, your resume immediately eclipses everyone else in the Senate.
So Augustus strategically adopts the title Divi Filius, which means son of the god. This was a daring, unprecedented move.
Extremely daring.
It allowed him to elevate his status above all his political rivals like Mark Antony. But the Romans were obsessed with legal and semantic precision, and there's a brilliant linguistic trick embedded in this title.
You're talking about the difference between Devus and Divus.
Exactly. The Romans had two distinct words for the divine. Devus meant a true, eternal, immortal, godlike Jupiter or Mars.
Right.
Divus meant a mortal human who had been elevated to a divine status after death. Augustus called himself the son of a Divus, not a Divus.
That's a huge distinction.
Within the sophisticated, hyperliterate political circles of Rome, this maintained a deliberate, necessary ambiguity. It was a way of saying, I have divine heritage, my authority is transcendent, without explicitly claiming to be an immortal deity walking around the Senate floor.
Because that would have deeply offended the traditional Republican sensibilities.
And probably gotten him assassinated just like his father.
Right. So he's walking a political tightrope. He needs the awe of the gods without the arrogance of a tyrant.
But outside the city walls of Rome, out in the wider, sprawling provinces like Gaul, Syria, or Judea, where the nuances of Latin vocabulary weren't as strictly parsed, that subtle linguistic distinction entirely vanished.
It just got lost in translation.
Out in the empire, the title Diva Filius was simply translated into Greek as Kurios, the all-son of God. Augustus began to be worshipped directly.
He minted massive amounts of coinage with this title, didn't he?
He did. He disseminated statues across the empire, showing him as perpetually youthful, calm, and perfect. It was a relentless propaganda campaign, equating imperial rule with divine sonship.
So if you're an average person living in the Mediterranean during the 1st century, the idea of a son of God walking around isn't a shock to the system.
Not at all.
You pay for your bread with a coin that literally says Son of God on it. It's the water you swim in. And it wasn't just emperors and palaces either. The sources emphasize how the ancient Mediterranean was absolutely brimming with wandering magicians, miracle workers, and grassroots godmen.
Classicists have long known this, even if it often makes modern theological frameworks uncomfortable. The ancient world was highly porous. The boundary between the physical and the spiritual was practically non-existent.
Do we have specific examples of these figures?
Oh, absolutely. We have detailed accounts of figures like Apollonius of Tyana, a Neo-Pythagorean philosopher and wandering holy man from the 1st century.
Okay.
The accounts of his life describe him performing feats that are strikingly parallel to those later attributed to Jesus.
Let's actually look at those parallels, because they are staggering. We're talking the greatest hits of biblical miracles.
Yeah, it's pretty wild.
Apollonius is recorded as casting out demons, healing the sick, raising a young Roman girl from the dead, just as her funeral procession is passing by.
Right.
And even surviving a trial before a tyrannical emperor Domitian by miraculously vanishing from the courtroom.
There is a specific account from the city of Ephesus where a plague breaks out. The citizens beg Apollonius for help. He gathers the city in the theater, points to a ragged beggar, and declares the beggar is a demon causing the plague.
Wow.
The crowd stones the beggar to death. When they clear the stones away, the human body is gone, and in its place is a massive, crushed hound, the demon, in its true form.
I mean, the visual of transferring a demon into an animal immediately brings to mind the gospel story of Jesus casting the legion of demons into a herd of swine.
It really does.
These weren't unique copyrighted superpowers, they were the expected cultural currency. If you wanted to prove you had a direct connection to the divine in the ancient Greco-Roman world, this was the resume you had to submit to the public.
Exactly. Catherine Nixie's book highlights something visually stunning to back this up. Our modern visual vocabulary for Jesus is very standardized. We see him with a halo, his hands open in a gesture of blessing, or perhaps pointing to his sacred heart.
Very serene.
But if you look at early Christian art, particularly in the Roman catacombs, you find multiple images of Jesus holding what looks exactly like a magic wand.
Wait, really? Like a literal physical wand?
Yes, literally. He is depicted using this wand or staff to perform miracles, like striking the rock to create water, or touching the tomb of Lazarus to raise him from the dead.
That is so wild to picture.
It highlights how fluid the boundaries were between religion, philosophy, and what the ancients simply considered magic. The early Christians were deliberately adopting the visual language of the pagan miracle workers to communicate Jesus' power to an audience that expected their gods to do magic.
Right. Now, before we explore how the specific Christian narrative evolved out of this crowded marketplace, it's vital to realize how other major world religions view this exact title, Son of God.
Because they all had to grapple with it.
Exactly. They all had to grapple with this pervasive ancient concept, and they all deliberately built theological firewalls against it.
The Islamic perspective is incredibly clear on this and acts as a direct theological refutation of the literalism that developed in Christianity.
How so?
Well, Islam completely rejects the idea of physical or biological sonship regarding the divine. In the Quran, Jesus is highly revered. He is known as Isa ibn Maryam, Jesus, son of Mary. He is acknowledged as a profound prophet, a messenger of God, and the Messiah sent to guide the Israelites.
But the relationship to the Creator is fundamentally different.
Completely different. The core mechanism of Islam is the absolute, indivisible, uncompromised unity of God, the concept of Tawheed.
Right.
To maintain this, Islam explicitly asserts that God does not beget, nor is he begotten. Ascribing a son to God is considered shirk, the ultimate sin of idolatry or polytheism.
So how do they view the virgin birth then?
Islam teaches that Jesus was born miraculously, yes, but by God's simple divine command, be. God ordered the angel Gabriel to blow the soul of Jesus into Mary. It's a miracle of creation, akin to the creation of Adam from dust, completely bypassing the messy, anthropomorphic idea that God literally fathered a child.
Got it. And the Baha'i faith approaches the title from a completely different angle, treating it as a profound metaphor rather than a biological reality.
Yes. In the Baha'i writings, the term Son of God is indeed applied to Jesus, but the mechanism of sonship is interpreted entirely spiritually. They view Jesus as a manifestation of God.
Like a reflection.
Think of God as the sun, and the manifestation is a perfectly polished mirror. When you look at the mirror, you see the sun shining brilliantly. The mirror is not the sun itself, but it purposely reflects its light, its attributes, and its authority.
Oh, that's a beautiful way to put it.
The sonship indicates this pure, unclouded spiritual reflection, completely stripping away the need for physical lineage.
So if the Romans and Egyptians were taking the Son of God title literally to consolidate power, I assume Judaism, being right there in the Mediterranean, was actively fighting off similar literal claims to protect its own monotheism.
Definitely. Judaism had a very well-developed framework for the phrase, and it was rigorously figurative. In the Hebrew Bible, Son of God or Sons of God is used, but it never implies physical descent from the Creator.
Right.
For instance, celestial beings or angels are called the sons of God in the book of Job. The entire nation of Israel is referred to as God's firstborn son in Exodus, signifying a special covenantal relationship.
And humans.
Pious kings, like David or Solomon, were given the title as a mark of divine favor. It was an adoption metaphor, essentially stating, "This king rules with my blessing and authority."
There's a fascinating archaeological artifact mentioned in the sources that brings us right to the doorstep of the 1st century, the Gabriel's Revelation Stone.
Oh, the Jerusalem stone. That's an incredible piece of evidence. It's a tablet dating from the late 1st century BCE, so literally just decades before the time of Jesus.
What does it say?
It's written in ink on stone, containing apocalyptic prophecies. It speaks of a messianic figure, a leader of Israel, who suffers and is called the Son of God.
Wow.
This proves that within the specific Jewish context of the time, the concept of a human, messianic Son of God facing tribulation was a vibrant idea already circulating in the culture right at the exact moment Christianity was born.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have a Mediterranean world teeming with sons of God. We have Roman emperors claiming divine adoption on their currency. We have wandering miracle workers raising the dead in the streets.
Yeah.
We have a Jewish theological framework expecting a messianic son. How on earth did one specific narrative, the story of a carpenter from Galilee, manage to outcompete all the others and conquer the Roman Empire?
That is the pivotal historical question, and the traditional answer is usually a neat, binary narrative. Christianity walked into the Roman arena, offered a superior moral vision, and defeated paganism.
Right, the garden path.
But the historical truth is much messier and much more violent. The reason Christianity triumphed wasn't just because it fought the outside world. It triumphed because a specific faction within Christianity successfully eradicated hundreds of competing Christian narratives that were fighting each other.
To understand this, we have to wade directly into the Wild West of early Christianity.
We really do.
The first 300 years after the crucifixion were not a time of peaceful, unified doctrinal agreement. It was an era of astonishing, unbridled, wildly experimental theological creativity.
Completely unregulated.
And this is where Catherine Nixie's book really shines. She dives into the apocryphal Thessalic Gospels, the stories that early Christians fiercely believed, lived by, and died for, but which were eventually declared illegal and erased from the official narrative.
When you read these texts, you realize immediately that the Jesus of early localized Christianity was not the standardized, serene, approachable figure we find in the modern canonical New Testament.
Not even close. Let's talk about the Gospel of James from the 2nd century.
Oh.
We all know the standard nativity story, right? Shepherds, a quiet manger, a star. But in the Gospel of James, the story takes a visceral, almost anatomical turn.
It really does.
During the birth, time literally stops. Birds freeze mid-flight in the sky. Workers freeze with their hands halfway to their mouths. But the most shocking part involves a midwife named Salome.
Right.
She arrives after the birth, and she is deeply skeptical of the claim that Mary is a virgin who just gave birth. So she demands to physically, medically check Mary's anatomy.
It is a startlingly graphic narrative for a holy text.
Extremely. And when Salome inserts her finger to check, her hand is miraculously burned off by a consuming fire. Nixie points out the sheer shock value of the text. But why write this?
Yeah, they weren't just writing horror stories for fun.
Right. They were fighting a theological battle. They needed to prove that the incarnation was a messy, physical reality to combat the emerging Greek idea that God was too pure to have a physical body.
That is the perfect way to look at it. Every bizarre story served a specific theological purpose for the community that wrote it.
Give me another example.
Take the infancy gospel of Thomas, which presents a remarkably different picture of the child Jesus. In the canonical Gospels of Matthew and Luke, Jesus' childhood is almost entirely blank.
Yeah, he's a baby. Then there's one story of him as a 12-year-old at the temple, and then suddenly he's an adult getting baptized.
But early Christians were intensely curious. They wanted to know what the Son of God was like as a toddler.
And according to this text, he was absolutely terrifying.
Terrifying.
In these stories, the child Jesus has the unlimited power of a god, but the emotional regulation of a cranky 6-year-old.
Right.
At one point, another child runs through the village and accidentally bumps into Jesus' shoulder. Jesus gets annoyed, turns around, and simply strikes the boy dead on the spot.
It's just wild to read.
And later, he strikes his school teachers blind or sometimes kills them when they try to discipline him or when they fail to grasp his infinite divine wisdom.
It reads like a modern superhero origin story, where the protagonist hasn't learned to control their powers yet. To modern sensibilities, it seems anti-Christian.
Yeah, it sounds like a villain origin story.
But to certain early Christian communities, it was a profound demonstration of raw, untamed divine power. It proved that Jesus wasn't just a normal, pious human who was somehow adopted or rewarded with holiness later in life. He was bursting with dangerous, uncontainable, terrifying divinity from the moment he could walk.
But the variations didn't stop at his childhood. Entire sects across the Mediterranean had fundamentally different views of who Christ was as an adult.
Oh, yeah. The adult variations are just as intense.
Some texts describe a Jesus who had a literal twin brother. In one narrative, Jesus travels to India. In another text, the Acts of Thomas, Jesus actually sells his own twin brother into slavery.
You also see incredible variations in how different communities understood the crucifixion itself.
How so?
The idea of the supreme creator God dying a shameful, humiliating death on a Roman cross was deeply offensive and, frankly, philosophically absurd to many Greek and Roman intellectuals.
That makes sense. It didn't fit their view of what a god is.
Exactly. So some sects adopted a docetic view. The term comes from the Greek word doki, meaning to seem.
So the idea that he was basically a phantom?
Yes. They believed the divine Christ only seemed to have a physical body. He was pure spirit, an illusion projected into the physical world.
Wow.
Therefore, he didn't really suffer on the cross. He couldn't suffer. It was just a performance. Or, in some variations, someone else, like Simon of Cyrene who carried the cross, was accidentally crucified in his place, while the true spiritual Jesus stood by on a hill, laughing at the Romans' ignorance.
It's like flipping through channels in a multiverse of belief. Nixie brings up other bizarre practices. In Ethiopia, Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor who literally ordered the crucifixion, isn't a villain.
No, he's revered.
He was revered as a saint, largely because some regional traditions believed he ultimately recognized Jesus' divinity and secretly converted.
Or consider the Ophites. They were a fascinating Gnostic sect who look at the Genesis story of the Garden of Eden and completely flip the script.
Flipped it how?
They believed the creator God of the Old Testament, who demanded blind obedience, punished humanity, and tried to keep Adam and Eve ignorant of good and evil, was actually an evil, lesser deity.
Wait, so who's the good guy?
The serpent. The serpent, who offered the fruit of the tree of knowledge, was the true hero. He was a messenger sent by the supreme hidden God of light to liberate humanity through knowledge.
Oh my God.
Therefore, they believed Christ, the ultimate liberator, appeared on earth in the form of a serpent.
And they didn't just write this down, they acted it out. They celebrated the Eucharist by placing loaves of bread on an altar and then releasing a live snake from a box to slither over the bread to consecrate it before they ate it.
It's just incredible.
We even have records of a first-century sect that believed King Herod, the tyrannical Roman-appointed king of Judea, was actually the long-awaited Messiah.
Which demonstrates just how desperate people were to identify a savior figure in the midst of Roman oppression. Every community was trying to map the concept of a savior onto their specific political and philosophical needs.
So, how do historians make sense of all this? We've gone from the neat botanical garden to an absolute theological jungle. How do we categorize this chaos?
The structural key to understanding this era is the work of a historian named Walter Bauer. In 1934, Bauer published a seminal, completely paradigm-shifting book called Orthodoxy and Heresy in Earliest Christianity.
Okay.
Before Bauer, the traditional accepted historical view was the tree and branches model.
Right, the idea that Jesus planted a single, pure, perfectly formed tree of truth, which was the Orthodox Church. And as time went on, little rogue branches of heresy sprouted off the side, which the vigilant church leaders then had to chop off to keep the main tree healthy.
Exactly. But Bauer looked at the actual geographical and historical evidence, and he realized that model was a complete fiction. It was backwards. Earliest Christianity wasn't a single tree. It was, as one modern reviewer beautifully put it, a field of diverse, competing saplings.
A field of saplings. I love that image. It changes the entire power dynamic.
Bauer argued that orthodoxy, which literally translates to right belief in heresy, didn't exist in a primary and secondary relationship. Heresy wasn't a deviation from a pre-existing norm.
Right.
In many geographical regions across the vast Mediterranean, what we now call a heresy was actually the very first and original form of Christianity to arrive there.
So if you lived in Edessa, your original version of Christianity might have been Marcionism. If you lived in Egypt, your very first exposure to Jesus might have been a Valentinian Gnosticism.
Yes.
These weren't corruptions of a local Orthodox standard. They were this standard.
Precisely. Orthodoxy was just one of many saplings in the field. It happened to be a particular political movement centered largely in Rome, which, over centuries of intense maneuvering, managed to grow taller, secure more funding, ally with the state, block out the sun, and choke out all the other saplings.
It reminds me of the early days of an open source software project.
Well, that's a great comparison.
There is no centralized corporate server. Different communities of coders across the Mediterranean are writing their own patches, forking the code, and adding completely new features, like a patch where Jesus travels to India, or a patch where he strikes a kid dead.
Yeah.
It's vibrant, incredibly creative, but totally incompatible. And the eventual triumph of orthodoxy wasn't a natural evolution. It was essentially a massive hostile corporate buyout.
Exactly.
One team seized the main servers, declared their specific code the only legal operating system, and started aggressively deleting everyone else's forks.
That is a phenomenal analogy. The early movement was decentralized, geographically scattered, and textually fluid. But eventually, the wild experimentation had to end. The messy field of saplings had to be pruned.
Right.
And this is the exact moment in history where the concept of heresy is invented, defined, and weaponized.
Let's dig into the mechanics of that weapon. To understand how a weapon is forged, you have to look at the raw materials. The term heresy sounds so heavy and loaded to us today, but what did it actually mean in the ancient world?
The etymology is fascinating because it is entirely innocent. The Greek word heresis did not originally mean a religious crime, a demonic deception, or a lie. It simply meant a choice, a course of action, or a school of thought.
It was completely neutral.
Completely neutral. In the Hellenistic world, if you decided to study Stoicism instead of Epicureanism, you were making a heresis. You were choosing a school of philosophy.
That's so interesting.
It was a normal, expected, and respected part of intellectual life. A diversity of heresis was considered a vital element in the pursuit of truth.
So how does a mundane word for choice morph into a word that gets you tied to a post and burned alive?
For that psychological shift, we have to look closely at a man named Justin Martyr, writing around the 150 CE. Robert M. Royalty Jr., in his book The Origin of Heresy, does a masterful job analyzing Justin's rhetoric. Justin was a Christian apologist living in Rome.
We should probably define that. An apologist wasn't someone apologizing for being wrong.
Yeah.
The word comes from the Greek apologia, meaning a legal defense. Justin is essentially acting as a PR representative and a defense attorney for his specific startup.
Correct. And Justin is facing a massive existential public relations problem. The Roman Empire views Christians with deep suspicion.
Why?
Because early Christians met in secret and talked about consuming the body and blood of their God and referred to each other as brother and sister, even if they were married. So the Romans genuinely suspected them of cannibalism and incest.
That is a terrible PR problem.
Right. Justin writes an apology to the Roman emperor, basically saying, "We are good, philosophical, law-abiding citizens. Please stop persecuting us."
But the political reality on the ground was undermining his argument. because there were other people in Rome, also publicly calling themselves Christians, who were teaching things and doing things that Justin absolutely despised.
Justin realizes he cannot defend the whole brand. He has to carve out his specific faction and throw everyone else under the bus. And his solution is a stroke of rhetorical genius, but it is deeply destructive. He creates a rigid artificial boundary. He labels his own specific group as orthoniumoi, the right-thinking ones. And he takes that neutral philosophical word heresis and turns it into a slur.
He tells the emperor, those other people calling themselves Christians, they aren't with us. They are a heresis. He transforms a philosophical choice into a marker of dangerous criminal deviance.
He constructs the enemy within, but he doesn't just say, we disagree on scriptural interpretation. He goes for the throat. He claims his rivals are directly, literally inspired by demons.
Let's look at his primary targets because they were massive threats to his authority. One was Simon Magus, a figure briefly mentioned in the book of Acts who Justin expands into a cosmic supervillain.
Oh, yeah.
Justin claims Simon was a dark magician who traveled with a former prostitute named Helen, deceiving the masses with demonic illusions. But his biggest target, the real threat, was Marcion of Sinope.
Marcion is a towering figure in early Christianity. To understand why Justin hated him, you have to understand why Marcion was so incredibly popular.
Why was he?
Marcion looked at the Hebrew Bible, and then he looked at the teachings of Jesus, and he concluded that they were completely morally incompatible.
Well, Marcion looked at the God of the Old Testament, a God who demanded blood sacrifice, ordered the slaughter of entire Canaanite cities, and instituted laws like an eye for an eye.
Right.
And he compared that to the Jesus who preached the Sermon on the Mount, who said to turn the other cheek and love your enemies.
Exactly. Marcion concluded that these could not possibly be the same being. It was logically impossible to him. So Marcion posited that there were two gods.
Two gods.
Yes. The God of the Old Testament was an angry, inferior, legalistic deity known as the demiurge, who created the flawed, painful, physical, material world. The God of Jesus, however, was a higher, purely spiritual, alien God of infinite love and light, who had previously been entirely unknown to humanity. Jesus was sent by this higher God to rescue human souls from the clutches of the demiurge.
You can immediately see why this spread like wildfire. It is a brilliant, clean solution to the classic problem of evil.
It really is.
Why is there suffering in the world? Because the world was created by an inferior, angry God. Marcion even created the very first formal canon of Christian scripture. He threw out the entire Old Testament, kept a heavily edited Gospel of Luke, and kept 10 letters of Paul.
Justin Martyr recognized exactly how dangerous Marcion's intellectual appeal was to his own right-thinking group, which insisted on the historical continuity between the Hebrew God and Jesus. So Justin attacks Marcion with everything he has.
What does he do?
He claims Marcion is aided by devils to make men blaspheme their true creator. But Justin goes a step further. He literally fabricates a demonic genealogy. Yeah, he links Simon Magus, who was by then largely a legendary figure, to a disciple named Menander, and then links them both to Marcion, who was a contemporary living person. He weaves these disparate, totally unrelated groups together into one giant, coordinated demonic conspiracy against the true church.
This is the aha moment. Justin didn't win a philosophical debate. He rigged the dictionary. He drew red strings on a corkboard, connecting people who never met, to convince the emperor that there is a unified evil network operating in the shadows.
Exactly.
The most effective way to destroy a competing idea isn't to out-argue it. It's to change the definition of words so that even holding the idea becomes a moral crime.
And this rhetorical strategy is highly effective. It establishes the foundational myth of Christian historiography, the myth of truth before error.
Which is what?
Following Justin's playbook, later writers like Hegesippus and the famous 4th century church historian Eusebius codified this myth into official history. They write massive volumes claiming that the original virgin church of the apostles was entirely unified, perfectly pure, and doctrinally flawless.
Sounds like the botanical garden again.
Exactly. According to them, vain messages and errors, which they retroactively label as heresies, only crept in after the death of the original apostles, brought by jealous, greedy men inspired by Satan to ruin the perfect garden.
But based on Walter Bauer's field of saplings, we know this completely inverts reality.
It's totally backwards.
The diversity came first. The wild, chaotic pluralism was the original natural state of affairs. The idea of a singular, pristine, unified early church is a retroactive historical fiction. It was a narrative written by the winners to justify silencing their rivals.
Yeah.
They painted themselves as the original defenders of an ancient truth, when in reality they were just one specific political faction aggressively imposing their version of truth on a highly pluralistic landscape.
So Justin Martyr builds the intellectual framework. He defines what a heretic is, a demonically inspired deviant pretending to be a Christian.
But changing the dictionary doesn't give you the power to actually enforce the new definitions.
No, it doesn't.
Writing angry letters and calling your theological rivals demons only goes so far when you are a persecuted underground minority. You cannot stop people in Egypt from reading the Gospel of Thomas just by complaining about it in Rome. To move from intellectual debate and name-calling to actual physical eradication, the Orthodox faction needed a weapon they didn't possess.
They needed the sword of the state.
Exactly.
Which brings us to one of the most monumental shifts in human history, the Constantinian shift. For nearly 300 years, Christians were an often persecuted minority. But in 313 CE, the Emperor Constantine issues the Edict of Milan, legalizing Christianity.
Suddenly, the underground startup is acquired by the empire.
And the power dynamic flips instantly. But why did Constantine do it? He wasn't just having the spiritual epiphany. He was a Roman emperor trying to hold together an incredibly vast, diverse, and fracturing empire.
Right. The Roman state traditionally demanded religious uniformity as a matter of civic loyalty. If you sacrificed to the emperor, you were a good citizen.
Constantine realizes that if Christianity is going to be the new glue holding his fracturing empire together, he needs it to be structurally sound. The empire cannot function if the Christians are constantly rioting in the streets of Alexandria over whether Jesus was created by the Father or co-eternal with the Father.
It's bad for business.
Exactly. The state needs theological unity to ensure political stability. One God, one emperor, one church.
And so the full weight of Roman law comes crashing down on the field of saplings. The definitive moment is in 380 CE, when the Emperor Theodosius III issues the Edict of Thessalonica. This decree makes Nicene Christianity the sole official legal state religion of the Roman Empire.
Right.
But the dark underside of that edict is that it officially makes heresy a literal crime against the Roman state.
We cannot overstate how paradigm-shifting this is. Before this edict, the church had no state-sponsored legal mechanism to address different beliefs. If you disagreed with your bishop, the worst they could do was excommunicate you from the local congregation.
They couldn't physically harm you.
Right. They couldn't touch your property or your body. But after 380, the distinction between church and state dissolves entirely. The legal enforcement powers of the Roman legions are handed directly to church authorities. The state is now in the brutal business of enforcing what is orthodox.
Let's talk about the specific theology they were enforcing, because Nicene Christianity didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was hammered out in the great ecumenical councils, Nicaea, Ephesus, Chalcedon.
Huge events.
These were massive imperial summits where hundreds of bishops gathered, ostensibly to debate theology, but practically to establish the legal, enforceable boundaries of human belief.
These councils were absolute battlegrounds over Christology, the specific, microscopic, metaphysical definitions of who Jesus was. At the Council of Nicaea in 325, the debate centered on Arianism.
What was Arianism?
A priest named Arius argued a very logical point. If Jesus is the Son, then he must have been begotten by the Father. Therefore, there must have been a time when the Son did not exist. He was created by the Father and is therefore subordinate to the Father.
But the opposing faction, led by Athanasius, argued that if Jesus was created, he isn't fully God, and therefore his sacrifice cannot save humanity. They insisted Jesus was co-eternal with the Father.
And the entire theological weight of the Roman Empire came down to a single Greek word, homoousios, meaning of the same substance, versus homoousios, meaning of a similar substance.
An empire was torn apart over a single letter, an iota.
Literally an iota. Athanasius and the homoousios faction won.
Yeah.
They rigidly defined the Trinity. If you held the Arian view, which millions of Christians did, including several Germanic tribes, you were no longer a dissenting thinker. You were a criminal. You were anathematized, officially cursed, and legally pursued.
The tactics used to enforce this new state-sponsored truth were chilling. We often picture early Christians as the innocent victims of persecution, bravely facing the lions in the Colosseum. We rarely talk about what happened when those persecuted Christians got the keys to the empire. The Church Fathers went after unauthorized texts with a vengeance. They systematically hunted down and literally burned the alternative Gospels. If you were caught possessing writings of Arius, the legal penalty was death.
The physical suppression of heretics involved brutal methods. Flogging was common. Steep fines were levied to bankrupt dissenting communities. Leaders were banished to the edges of the empire, and their church property was confiscated and handed over to the Orthodox bishops.
And some of the accounts Nixie highlights are just horrific.
Yeah, in some of the most shocking accounts, the church employed horrific, calculated methods of execution. They would row suspected heretics out to sea, tie a heavy sandbag around their necks, and throw them overboard to drown.
There is a very specific, dark psychological logic to the sandbags. Why go through the trouble of rowing them out to sea? Why not just execute them in the public square to make an example of them?
Because the Orthodox church leaders deeply understood the power of martyrs. Their entire institution had been built on the blood of martyrs who died bravely under pagan emperors.
Oh, wow.
If you publicly execute a heretic, their followers can claim the body, they can bury it, venerate the tomb, build a shrine, and turn that victim into a powerful new martyr for their cause, fueling future resistance.
So by drowning them at sea with a weight, the body is lost forever.
Exactly. There is no relic, no shrine, no focal point for grief or rebellion. It is a calculated attempt at total physical, historical, and spiritual erasure.
Complete annihilation. And the milestone for this bloodshed occurs incredibly quickly. Just 5 years after the Edict of Thessalonica in 385 CE, a wealthy bishop from Spain named Priscillian becomes the very first Christian to be officially executed by the state.
At the behest of other Christians.
Yes, for crime of heresy. He and several of his followers were beheaded in Trier for holding dualistic, Gnostic-leaning ascetic views.
I often wonder what this actually meant for the average person living back then. You're a farmer in Alexandria or a baker in Antioch. Did they actually care about the metaphysical definitions of the hypostatic union, or were they just terrified of the sandbags?
It was a bizarre mixture of both. On one hand, theological debates in cities like Constantinople were intensely popular and highly politicized. Gregory of Nyssa famously complained that if you went to the market and asked a baker for the price of bread, the baker would reply with a heated philosophical argument about whether the Son is subordinate to the Father.
That's hilarious. But on the other hand, for the vast majority of rural populations, religious uniformity simply became a brutal tool of imperial control. The top-down imposition of dogma meant that local, vibrant, indigenous expressions of faith that had survived for centuries were systematically crushed by imperial troops.
And once you build a bureaucratic machine designed specifically to hunt down and destroy ideological difference, you cannot easily turn it off. Even after the Roman Empire formally collapses, this mechanism of heresy doesn't fade away.
No, it just adapts.
It adapts. It becomes the defining, terrifying feature of European history for over a millennium.
The concept of heresy, weaponized by state power, bridges late antiquity and the Middle Ages seamlessly. The Catholic Church, having inherited the legal and administrative structure of the Roman Empire, continues to use this exact framework to rigidly police intellectual boundaries.
The list of targets during the Middle Ages is staggering, but let's look at the mechanics of why certain groups were targeted. Take the Cathars in southern France during the 12th and 13th centuries.
Right, the Cathars.
They were dualists who essentially revived the old Gnostic idea from Marcion. They believed the physical material world was an evil snare created by an evil god, and the human soul needed to be freed through extreme purity and asceticism.
And why was that specific belief such a massive threat to Rome? Because if you believe that all physical matter is inherently evil and corrupt, then you look at the Catholic Church with its immense physical wealth, its vast land ownership, its ornate gold-lined cathedrals, and its politically powerful bishops.
And you conclude that the church itself is the ultimate manifestation of demonic corruption.
Exactly. The Cathars weren't just a theological annoyance. They were a fundamental economic and political threat to the legitimacy of the church's power structure. So the church didn't just excommunicate them. Pope Innocent III launched the Albigensian Crusade in 1209.
A literal military crusade.
Complete with massive armies, sieges, and massacres directed against fellow Europeans in southern France to wipe the Cathar sapling off the face of the earth.
And this military campaign leads directly to the formalization of the Inquisition. At the beginning of the 13th century, the papacy establishes the Inquisition, eventually putting it under the control of intellectual orders like the Dominicans and Franciscans. Their job was to systematically inquire into spiritual deviance, hold tribunals, and extract confessions.
And extract is the darkest operative word in that sentence. In 1252, Pope Innocent V issues a papal bull called Ad Extirpanda, which officially authorizes the use of physical torture by the Inquisition to force confessions from suspected heretics.
The targets constantly shifted to encompass any threat to the establishment. You have the Waldensians, who preached apostolic poverty and translating the Bible, directly challenging church wealth.
Yeah.
The Lollards in England, followers of John Wycliffe, who rejected the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation. And eventually, the machinery of heresy turns its sights on the emerging scientific revolution.
We have to talk about Giordano Bruno. In the year 1600, he was led into the Campo de' Fiori in Rome, stripped naked, had his tongue tied so he couldn't speak, and was burned alive at the stake.
Horrifying.
He's often remembered today as a martyr for science because he supported Copernicanism and theorized that the universe was infinite, containing countless inhabited worlds.
The modern historians point out his trial was incredibly complex. He wasn't simply executed for his cosmological views, right?
Right, he was deeply heretical in a traditional theological sense, too. He denied the core tenets of the Trinity, the virginity of Mary, and the concept of eternal damnation. But his execution vividly demonstrates the mechanism any deviation, whether it was a new scientific observation or a revived theological debate that threatened the totalizing worldview of the Church, was ultimately met with terminal violence.
Which brings us to the profound historical irony of the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. You have bold reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin. They look at the Catholic Church, the rampant sale of indulgences, the deep corruption, and they bravely break away.
Yeah.
They argue for sola scriptura alone as the authority and justification by faith. Rome, operating exactly as it had for 1,000 years, immediately labels them heretics. Pope Leo X issues a papal bull excommunicating Luther in 1521.
But once the Protestants successfully break away and establish their own localized power structures, they don't abolish the concept of heresy. They don't declare universal freedom of religion.
No. They pick up the exact same pruning shears, they ally with their local secular princes, and they start using heresiological violence against their rivals. It's the Protestant paradox. They fought for the freedom to dissent from Rome, but brutally denied that same freedom to anyone dissenting from them.
Martin Luther's trajectory is deeply tragic in this regard. Early in his career, when he was the underdog, he explicitly wrote that it is contrary to the Spirit to burn heretics. It was a beautiful, tolerant sentiment.
Not then.
But years later, when a radical Protestant sect known as the Anabaptists emerged, Luther's stance hardened into iron.
The Anabaptists believed in adult baptism, meaning you had to choose the faith, not be born into it, and crucially, they believed in the absolute separation of church and state.
Which was incredibly dangerous to the reformers who relied on state princes for protection. By 1530, Luther was actively advocating for the death penalty against the Anabaptists. At the Diet of Speyer in 1529, Catholics and Lutherans, who hated each other, actually signed a mutual agreement on one specific issue: Anabaptists must be put to death.
John Calvin, the great reformer who turned Geneva into a rigid theocracy, operated the exact same machinery. When Michael Servetus, a brilliant polymath who not only denied the doctrine of the Trinity, but also discovered the pulmonary circulation of blood, fled the Catholic Inquisition, he made the mistake of going to Geneva seeking refuge.
Big mistake.
Calvin had him arrested, tried for heresy, and burned at the stake in 1553 over a pile of his own books.
The Reformed Protestant churches lacked the massive centralized Inquisition of Rome, but they were just as willing to utilize the secular state to execute individuals who threatened their new, localized orthodoxies. Whether you were Catholic or Protestant, the underlying logic of the civilization remained identical.
That ideological difference is a terminal disease that must be physically excised from the body politic to protect the whole.
Exactly. And this bloody mechanism chugged along for centuries. Most people think of inquisitions and burnings as strictly medieval phenomena, something that ended with the Renaissance. But the sources note that this machinery continued operating until shockingly recently.
Wait, really? How recent?
The final execution by the Spanish Inquisition was not in the 1400s or the 1500s. It was in 1826. A Spanish schoolmaster named Cayetano Ripoll in Valencia was arrested, held in prison for 2 years, and finally hanged.
What was his crime?
He was accused of deism, He taught his students about a creator God, but he refused to take them to Mass, and he substituted the phrase, "Praise be to God," in place of Ave Maria. For that, he was hanged.
1826. Think about that timeline. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams both died that exact same year. The first steam locomotives were already operating. The modern world had arrived. And a man was legally hanged for heresy.
Unbelievable.
It shows how deeply, stubbornly ingrained the necessity of enforcing ideological conformity was in the European psyche. It took the Enlightenment, massive cultural revolutions, and the strict legal secularization of the state to finally wrench the power of execution out of the hands of religious authorities.
So, sitting here today, looking back at thousands of years of theological bloodshed, how do we process this? How do modern historians, believers, and secular critics reconcile this brutal, violent historical reality with the moral teachings of a religion centered on a man who famously preached, "Love your enemies"?
That tension is the nexus of the modern debate. And Catherine Nixie points out a deep frustration she has with how this history is handled in modern academia. She calls it a conspiracy of silence, or a gentleman's agreement between classicists and theologians.
Let's explore the mechanics of that agreement. Classicists, the scholars who study ancient Greece and Rome, know full well that the ancient world was saturated with magic, myth, and wandering god-men.
Yeah.
They know that the accounts of Apollonius of Tyana read almost exactly like the Gospels.
Right. But historically, particularly in the elite academic environments of the 19th and 20th centuries, many of those classicists were also operating within culturally Christian institutions like Oxford or Cambridge.
Yeah.
So out of a polite deference to religion, they rarely applied that same critical, deconstructive lens to the historical Jesus in their public work. They would eagerly, ruthlessly dissect the myths of Apollo or Hercules, identifying all the cultural tropes, but they would leave the Gospels in a separate, highly protected category of objective history.
And Nixie argues this deference has artificially insulated the origins of Christianity from the kind of rigorous comparative scrutiny it actually deserves.
Right.
Nixie goes further, identifying a massive psychological blind spot that affects how the general public views this history. It's a cognitive bias known as the just world fallacy.
This is a brilliant concept. The just world fallacy is the deep-seated psychological need to believe that the world is inherently fair and therefore people ultimately get what they deserve. Good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people.
When you apply this bias to the sweep of history, it slides very easily into the belief that whoever won history must have deserved to win. It implies that the events of the past, even the incredibly violent ones, were somehow meant to be, and were ultimately for the best development of human civilization.
So when applied to our topic, it means looking at the triumph of Orthodox Christianity over the pagans and the Gnostics and assuming, well, it must have survived because it was inherently better, truer, or more moral than the alternatives. The best ideas naturally rise to the top.
Exactly. But Nixie attacks this mindset head-on. She specifically targets what she calls Christian exceptionalism.
A prime example she cites is the narrative found in works by popular historians like Tom Holland, who wrote the book Dominion. The core argument of Christian exceptionalism is that Christianity triumphed because it entered a brutal, cruel, stratified Roman world as a unique, unprecedented blessing.
Right, offering radical kindness, universal compassion, charity for the poor, and the revolutionary idea of equality before God concepts. The pagan world supposedly completely lacked.
This narrative suggests that Christianity succeeded purely on the strength of its superior moral merits.
But Nixie's counterargument is fierce and grounded in the physical evidence we just discussed. She says, no, look at the reality. Look at the sandbags tied around the necks of drowning Christians. Look at the bonfires of alternative gospels. Look at Justin Martyr rigging the dictionary to turn philosophy into treason.
Right.
Christianity didn't win simply because it was uniquely kind. It won through historical contingency, blind political chance, and a ruthless, systemic, centuries-long willingness to physically destroy alternative viewpoints with state violence. It wasn't fated by God or morality. It was enforced by the sword.
It is a powerful, highly disruptive secular critique of Western history. But to maintain our impartial lens on the deep dive, we must look at the counter perspective. And our source stack provides a very thoughtful academic rebuttal from Henry Wansbrough, reviewing Nixie's book in the Church Times.
Wansbrough is a Benedictine monk and a serious, highly respected biblical scholar. And what's fascinating is that he doesn't shy away from the dark stuff, not at all. He openly acknowledges that the Church's relentless pursuit of theological conformity through brutal intolerance torture, and burnings, is a source of profound modern horror and shame. He doesn't deny the violence of the Inquisition or the cruelty of the pruning shears.
He concedes the brutality of the historical suppression entirely. However, he sharply criticizes Nixie's methodology and her conclusions regarding the early theology itself. First, he argues her book lacks crucial Old Testament context.
Yes.
You cannot fully understand the historical claims about Jesus without understanding the deep, complex roots of Jewish prophecy and typology that the early Christians were drawing upon to make sense of his life.
He also points out a massive, glaring theological gap in her narrative regarding the timeline of Christian belief.
Oh, about St. Paul.
Yes. Wansbrough argues that Nixie utterly fails to grapple with the profound, highly developed Christology of St. Paul. Paul's letters are the oldest texts in the New Testament, written in the 50s CE, decades before the Gospels were even finalized.
Right.
And in those early letters, like the famous hymn in Philippians 2, where Paul describes Christ as existing in the form of God but emptying himself to become human, you see a highly sophisticated cosmic understanding of who Jesus was, existing right there in the mid-first century.
So Wansbrough's point is that by minimizing Paul, Nixie's picture of early Christian history as merely a chaotic scramble of random magic men is deeply skewed. The high theology wasn't just invented by councils 300 years later. The seeds of it were there from the very beginning.
And regarding the comparisons to figures like Apollonius of Tyana, Wansbrough points out a significant chronological flaw in Nixie's argument. The most famous, detailed account of Apollonius's life and miracles was written by Philostratus in the 3rd century, roughly 200 years after the life of Jesus and long after the Christian Gospels were widely circulated.
So the timeline is flipped.
Exactly. Wansbrough argues that you cannot use a highly stylized 3rd century text to invalidate the depictions of Jesus written in the 1st century. He implies that it is highly probable the stories of Apollonius were actually influenced by or written specifically to compete with the already successful Christian Gospels, rather than the other way around.
It is a profound clash of methodologies. We have Nixie arguing that orthodoxy is a brutal political construct that stamped out a beautiful, vibrant diversity. And we have Wansbrough arguing that while the later methods of imperial suppression were shameful, the core sophisticated theology of orthodoxy was a natural outgrowth of seeds planted in the 1st century.
If we step back and connect this entire debate to the bigger picture, whether you find yourself agreeing with Nixie's secular deconstructive critique or Wansbrough's historical and theological defense, an indisputable historical fact remains.
What's that?
The Christianity we inherited, the doctrines printed in modern Bibles, the creeds recited in churches across the globe today, these are the products of intense, messy human curation. They are the result of political maneuvering, fierce intellectual debates, and the total systematic suppression of vibrant, competing ideas over centuries.
The beautiful botanical garden of modern belief was built by violently clearing the jungle.
Precisely. The path wasn't clear from the beginning. It was paved over the graves of the saplings that weren't allowed to grow.
So what does this all mean for us? Let's summarize this incredible journey we've taken today. We started in a diverse Roman Empire, a world perfectly comfortable with the idea of sons of God, divine emperors, and wandering miracle workers.
Yeah.
We entered the wild creative explosion of early Christian sects, where Jesus was everything from a fire-breathing infant to a purely spiritual phantom, where some Christians revered the Serpent of Eden and others thought Pontius Pilate was a saint.
We then witnessed the brilliant, dark rhetorical turn of Justin Martyr, taking a neutral word for choice, heresis, and rigging the dictionary to turn it into a label for demonic deviance. We saw how the Roman Empire adopted this framework to enforce political stability, making heresy a crime punishable by death.
And burying the diverse saplings under the heavy weight of ecumenical councils, state decrees, and sandbags.
Right. And we tracked how that machinery of suppression survived the fall of Rome, fueling the medieval crusades, creating the torture chambers of the Inquisition, burning scientists at the stake, and surviving even the Protestant Reformation.
Proving that the human desire to enforce ideological purity crosses all theological lines.
Which brings us directly back to you, the listener. Because history is never just a study of the dead past. It is a mirror reflecting the mechanics of the present.
Think about the information you consume every single day. Think about the accepted orthodoxies in your life right now. Maybe it's the rigid corporate culture in your workplace where dissenting ideas are quietly punished.
Or the strict, unforgiving ideological purity tests demanded by your political party.
Or maybe it's just the mainstream cultural narratives we all take for granted as obvious truth. This history proves that what we consider obviously true or mainstream today isn't necessarily the whole story. It is very often just the survivor of a brutal historical pruning process. The ideas we accept as absolute truth are often just the ideas whose opponents were successfully silenced centuries ago.
Which leaves us with a vital, uncomfortable question to consider as we close. If the word heresy originally just meant to make a choice, we have to look very closely at the mechanics of our highly polarized modern world.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Today, disagreeing with the in-group on a single issue can get you canceled, exiled from your social community, or professionally ruined overnight. The modern mechanisms of social enforcement are incredibly swift, highly coordinated, and utterly unforgiving. So we must ask ourselves, have we really outgrown the medieval urge of the Inquisition, or have we just changed the name of the church?
The next time you find yourself entirely certain that your specific group is entirely right and the other side is entirely wrong, or even evil, remember the jungle. Remember the lost gospels, the drowned dissenters, and the deeply messy, chaotic reality of human belief. The paved path of the botanical garden might be much easier to walk, but the deepest truths are usually hiding somewhere off in the weeds. Thank you for taking the deep dive with us.